Spirit.
Amen.
Now, you wouldn't know it, given the attendance at your average Epiphany worship service. But in some parts of the world, the Feast of the Epiphany is actually more popular than Christmas. In Spain, for example, families pack sidewalks for parades to celebrate the wise men and their journey. In many Latin American countries, this day, Dia de los Tres Reyes, this is the day that children receive presents, with the Magi being the ones who deliver gifts. Actually, a way more fitting understanding of getting gifts around this time of year, given the biblical narrative, but you know. Similarly, on Italy, on the eve of the Epiphany, Italian children wake up to gifts and candy in celebration of the day. One of the reasons these global celebrations make sense is because Epiphany is actually the more ancient feast that celebrates the mystery of the Incarnation. There's evidence that some Christians were already celebrating this holiday by the end of the 2nd century. Its official listing comes from early in the 4th century, and from that time on, the celebrations of Epiphany spread. It wasn't until almost 100 years later in the 4th century, by contrast, that we have any evidence of someone celebrating something known as Christmas. So that means, of course, that you, my trusty group of worshipers tonight, along with those participating online, you're just good old-fashioned traditionalists. Bravo. The familiar Epiphany traditions that you and I are most familiar with date from just a few centuries later as well. You will notice, of course, that the biblical narrative in the gospel doesn't refer to how many wise men or magi that there were, just that the gifts numbered 3. In fact, some earlier traditions of the church said that there were as many as 12 wise men who made this journey. It was actually the Venerable Bede, writing in England at the turn of the 7th century, who came up with that number of 3 wise men, and who also gave them their traditional names. Anyone know the names? Casper, Melchior, Balthazar, right? Melchior being an old man with a long white beard, Gaspar being described as a young man, ruddy-faced. I don't have to know what ruddy-faced mean, but I've always felt like I wanted to be that, right? And then Balthazar being the mysterious, dark-skinned one. But however many there were, no matter their names, the Magi themselves were likely from Babylon, the ancient seat of astrological studies, or perhaps from Persia as Zoroastrians. That's what they were after all, right? They really weren't wise men or kings. They were astrologers who had devoted their lives to watching the sky in search of truth, in search of hope. And there's several ancient writers that talk about how astrologers from Babylon would regularly travel west to visit imperial kings, the most notable being the reports of astrologers who visited Nero in the year 66, accounted in 3 different texts. So this was a normal thing to do, even if upon their arrival they were greeted with a far from normal scene. And if you think about it, well, the Epiphany story of the wise men is one that's full of rich and familiar images to many of us. It's actually a little strange to find a story like this in Matthew's gospel, of all places. After all, it's Luke's gospel. It's the one that's most concerned with stories of the birth and childhood of Jesus. Luke's gospel is the one written to a Gentile audience that would probably find hope in these Gentiles coming to worship. But Matthew's gospel, likely originally written in Hebrew to a Jewish audience. How very strange. How very strange that the beginning of Matthew's story does not tell of a visit of Jewish leaders, not even the Jewish shepherds. Those are in Luke. But Matthew tells a story of pagan astrologers who come and bow down before the Christ child. How strange, unless, of course, the oddity of the pagan astrologers is exactly Matthew's point. Perhaps here at the beginning of Matthew's story, written to first century Jews, he wants to make it clear that the religious of his own time missed Christ when he came. That in fact the religious powers conspired to kill him even at his birth, when outside of today's text, Matthew tells us that Herod used the information from the Magi to slaughter all the children in Bethlehem who were 2 years old or younger. After all, it's later in Matthew's Gospel, in the Sermon on the Mount, that we will hear Jesus tell his disciples in chapter 7, "Ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and the door will be opened." The Magi, after all, were those who sought, right? The Magi, they're from the wrong country. They're not citizens of Israel. They're not even believers in God. And yet they seek. They seek. And God blesses their seeking, not only with the experience of God and the Christ child, but God protects them when after this he warns them to go back home by another road to avoid the murderous rage of Herod. God seems to have a thing for seekers in this story. It's interesting, the language and the themes of the visitation of the Magi are actually echoed again at the end of Matthew's Gospel. In our reading for today, when Herod hears that the Magi in Jerusalem are asking where the child to be born king was, Herod is afraid. He assembles the Sanhedrin, all of the chief priests and the scribes of Israel, to figure out where this king will be born, to send the Magi in the right direction so he can follow them and kill the kid. Later, much later, near the end of the gospel, when Jesus begins teaching of his coming death, he says it's going to be at the hands of the elders, the scribes, and the chief priests. It is this same group, the Sanhedrin, who is dismayed by his entry into Jerusalem, by his cleansing of the temple. It is the same group, the Sanhedrin, who then assembles with the plan to put Christ to death, who tries him and hands him over to the secular powers of their time. But when Christ rises from the dead after his death, when the disciples see the risen Lord in chapter 28, what's fascinating is that they do the same thing that the Magi did at the very beginning of the gospel. In our translation for today, we're told that when the Magi saw the Christ child, they paid homage, right? They paid homage, but the Greek word is proskunuo, a word that literally means to bow down and kiss, a word that's usually translated in the New Testament as worship. When Matthew describes what the Magi do upon seeing the Christ child, he uses that word, proskuneo. He says they bowed down and worshiped. And then later, when the disciples see the risen Lord in Matthew 28, he uses the same word, saying that the disciples then bowed down and worshiped the risen Christ. How fascinating. How fascinating that it was these strange pagan astrologers who were the first to worship, long before any of the rest of the disciples had any clue what was going on. In fact, that really gives a different sense to the Great Commission which Jesus gives his disciples after they worship him, when he commands them to go, make disciples of all nations. Maybe, just maybe, part of the point isn't so much that the disciples needed to go to all nations to tell them what they'd learned, and rather that they were intended to go to all nations to find the disciples already there who didn't even know they'd been called. They were being sent into all nations to find seekers everywhere looking for God and struggling to find him, and to tell those people that God had indeed come near to them in Jesus Christ. I think in the end, that's what I really love about the Feast of the Epiphany. Everyone gets an invitation. No matter where you come from, no matter what you believe or what you can't really bring yourself to believe. no matter what journey you're on, all are welcome to seek. And if you will have the courage to seek, God promises you will find. At the end of your seeking, you will find. You may not find exactly what you were looking for or what you thought you were looking for. You may be surprised by what God has for you at the other end of your seeking. After all, the Magi probably didn't expect to find a small child living in a working class family. But when they found it, didn't bother them that it was not what they expected in a king. Didn't bother them in the least. They sought, they found, and they worshipped. And so you also, beloved of God, on this cold Epiphany night, don't give up. Keep seeking. Keep looking. Keep pushing through the long, cold journey of faith to see what God has for you in places unexpected and unimagined. No matter what you've been told before by the so-called religious and powerful of this world, don't give up. Keep looking. Because if you seek, you will find a God whose love becomes manifest, a God who puts on flesh in the vulnerable places of this world. You will find this God's love for you. Yes, you. And if you don't have much to bring, don't worry. It's not really about the gifts after all. What really matters is that when you find this love, you recognize that this love is not someone else's, but that this love is for you. And so you know that it's your job to bow down, give thanks,